would love for us all to have a fierce voice, to share this scripture in a fierce voice today. So I'm going to invite whatever staff want to come to the mics. We'll read it through once for you. It's right up here. And then I'd like this half of the congregation to read it in a fierce voice toward that half of the congregation. And then we'll scroll through it a third time so it really soaks all the way in. This half of the congregation, read it in a fierce voice for this half of the congregation. So we all get to feel what it is to have Isaiah prophesy fiercely to us. You ready? Share your bread with those who are hungry and shelter homeless people. Clothe those who are naked and don't hide from the needs of your own flesh and blood. Do this, and your light will shine like the dawn, and your healing will break forth like lightning. Your integrity will go before you, and the glory of Yahweh will be your rear guard. You will rebuild ancient ruins and build upon age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of ruined neighborhoods. And now back to the beginning. On the count of three, this half of the congregation. 1, 2, 3.
Share your bread with those who are hungry and shelter homeless poor people. Clothe those who are naked and don't hide from the needs of your own flesh and blood. Do this, and your light will shine like the dawn, and your healing will break forth like lightning. Your integrity will go before you, and the glory of Yahweh will be your rear guard. You will rebuild ancient ruins and build upon age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of ruined neighborhoods.
And now this half of the congregation on the count of three. 1, 2, 3.
Share your bread with those who are hungry and shelter homeless poor people. Clothe those who are naked and don't hide from the needs of your own flesh and blood. Do this, and your light will shine like the dawn, and your healing will break forth like lightning. Your integrity will go before you, and the glory of Yahweh will be your rear guard. You will rebuild ancient ruins and build upon age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of ruined neighborhoods.
The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Beloved, will you pray with me? God, you spoke these words through your prophet Isaiah at a specific time and a specific place. But we know because every week we open up your ancient words that you speak them freshly to us into a new context. You long for them to come alive again. May it be so today. Amen. The other night, 2 great streams came together as one when the Fire Recovery Committee and the Blue Sky Visioning Team met jointly for the first time. Together, we were the FRC BSVT of FCCB. I think that phrase is going to go down in history. For the newbies in the crowd, the Fire Recovery Team is the boots on the ground after the fire that gutted about a third of our church campus, helping us sift through issues of insurance, the permitting process, demolition, and repairing the sanctuary that is almost finished. Woo! And preparing the way to rebuild our ministry building known as Pilgrim Hall. The Blue Sky Team, on the other hand, is the pie in the sky, charged with helping elicit God's vision for how we might rebuild in a way that will serve our congregation and community for the next 100 years. Thank you for that. One of the items on the agenda was the shared wall that stands between the sanctuary and Pilgrim Hall. Because you see, when we added Pilgrim Hall to the campus almost 100 years ago, we used the existing sanctuary wall as the fourth wall for Pilgrim. This was convenient. It befitted thrifty folks, thrifty Congregationalists, many of whom hailed from New England originally. And it also made a nice metaphor for connectedness. But you see, it made each structure less stable, as forces from normal thermal expansion to the occasional earthquake acted upon both buildings at the same time through this one wall. And so that's why at the meeting last week, some of our leaders told the others, in the rebuild, we will have to build a new wall. And you could have heard the shudder that went through the crowd when that was said out loud in Berkeley, California. And then one half of those gathered hastily chorused to the other half, not that wall. There's been a lot of wall talk the last few months in our national conversation. And just this week, the question of building a wall on our southern border to keep out those people was raised again and deferred again. And I pray it will be deferred indefinitely, because it's a proposition that is an expensive boondoggle and, more importantly, deeply immoral. But it begs the question, for those of us who do not believe there should be a wall, what then do we do with those who come across the southern expanse into our country, our state, our city, our neighborhood? We heard Estella's story today. We heard her crying out to God, a prayer for sanctuary, for home. Who is on the other side of that wall answering the prayer? Our belief that there should not be a wall says passively or actively that we are prepared to take some level of responsibility for the welcome and the well-being of those who come. Robert Frost famously poemed, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." But later in his poem, he challenges his own assertion. He says, "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense." The fact of the matter is, walls don't just keep things and people out, they also keep things and people in. They protect the people inside those walls. They shelter them from enemies and storms. The prophet Isaiah wrote a really long book. Just going off of chapter count, he won the contest among the Hebrew prophets. His conversation with his people spanned centuries. See, he wasn't just one person, he was multiple writers. But when the person we call Isaiah, the author, starts talking to his people, at the beginning, they're settled, they're prosperous, they're living in their own country. And he follows them as they're deported to Babylon, exiled for decades. And then he stays with them and he follows them back to Judah as the Babylonian exile is ending. Not everyone's come at once. A few hardy pilgrims came first. And this should feel like a triumphant moment after decades of displacement. For years they have dreamed of how wonderful it would be when they went home, of how everything would go back to normal. But of course it doesn't work that way. There's no such thing as going back exactly to the way things were, because every journey we take changes us. Life was hard for the early returnees. The temple was still in ruins, which was a heartbreak to see day after day, and many of the homesteaders had a hard scrabble life. Worse, the ones who managed to do well back in their country oppressed the ones who didn't do well, subjugated them, and made them second-class citizens. Their own kin they did this to. This is the context into which Isaiah was preaching. Remember what he said? He said, "Share your bread with those who are hungry. Say it quietly with me. Shelter homeless poor people. Clothe those who are naked. And don't hide from the needs of your own flesh and blood. Do this, and your light will shine like the dawn, and your healing will break forth like lightning. Your integrity will go before you, and the glory of Yahweh will be your rear guard. You will rebuild ancient ruins and build upon age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of ruined neighborhoods. Walls aren't all bad, see? In ancient cities, the wall around the city was the exoskeleton that protected the people inside from people outside who wanted to do them harm. And the people who lived in the surrounding countryside, when the enemy armies arrived, would come rushing inside the walls for safety. But if the enemy managed to breach the wall, everyone's security was threatened. Keeping the people whole meant keeping the wall whole. Enemies look different today in our city. We're not expecting an Assyrian invasion any second. But vulnerable people fear other forces, just as detrimental to body and soul. Poverty, income inequality, systemic racism, and ICE's willy-nilly deportations. And one of the most vulnerable places in the protective wall is unaffordable housing. The high cost of housing is forcing poor and even less poor people into inhumane housing situations. That housing looks like roaches and bed bugs. It looks like living in fire traps that swallow a whole generation of young artists in a couple of hours. It looks like rats that menace small children at night, cold water showers, no heat in winters. It looks like teens kicked out of their homes because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, who then trade sex for a safe place to sleep. It looks like self-medication of mental illness with drugs and alcohol that ends people up on the street. It looks like cops and teachers and builders who have to drive 3 to 4 hours a day round trip to their jobs here. All real people I have met in the last year who never see their children. Their children are being raised by others, sometimes in substandard daycare. Their teens are unsupervised after school, and it's putting further stress and strain on their marriages, on their parenting, on their children's hopes of breaking the cycle. At church council the other night, as an icebreaker, I asked folks, what was the worst place you have ever lived? The exercise elicited some hilarious memories and some hard ones. But most of us confessed that we were lucky. We had never really had it that bad. There were stories of huts during Peace Corps stints, violent neighbors. But in even the hardest situation, there was a sense that the hardship was temporary. It was a chapter, not a novel. And some of you feel this truth in your gut because you know that for your own children, things might be very different if they didn't have your support, if they didn't have an in-law apartment or a basement apartment, if they didn't have a little help with the rent or the mortgage. But for the blessing of your stability, they might be staring into that breach in the wall, wondering what's about to come through at them. Now, we have a very important decision to make soon in regard to walls. Our walls at the corner of Dana and Channing came down. We need to decide how to put them back up, how high they will go, who they will let in, who they will keep out. We can decide to rebuild what was there, 3 stories, for our own use, which is probably, we're not certain about this, but probably the fastest option, though not necessarily the most affordable. Or we can open our hearts and minds to the possibility of adding 2 to 3 stories of affordable housing on top of what we build for our own needs. In 1 week, May 7th, after church next week, you will meet some folks who can begin to answer questions about what a project like that might look like, funding, timing. And Dan Leverton has asked Mo and Amy and Scott, who all have expertise in affordable housing, to put together a model for us, to begin to crunch the numbers. Some things we know out of the gate are we would not be the landlords. The developer would be, which would leave us free to be in a different kind of relationship with those who would live there. We would get to have a say in which populations live in the units because people who need affordable housing look a lot of different ways. Low-income seniors, homeless students, youth coming out of foster care, first responders, teachers, undocumented workers in the shadow economy, and me. I grew up the beneficiary of Section 8 vouchers my entire childhood. But for a generous rent subsidy and my mother's savvy in choosing cheap but safe neighborhoods with good public schools, I doubt that I would be your senior minister today. I am what affordable housing looks like, grown up. Beloved, we are in a Kairos moment when God has aligned so much to make it easier to build good walls. We have a new mayor and city council eager to support proposals. We have the A1 Affordable Housing Bond Money, an initiative you helped pass last November, coming online and bringing almost $900 million. We have potential financial partners who could offset our own shortfall, as well as fund the project itself. And we have a broken building in the downtown area of one of the most coveted real estate markets in the country. We have a serious housing crisis, and we have a church that voted last summer to make housing one of its outreach and mission priorities. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the number 1 priority we voted for. I'm not saying it would be easy to do this. It would not be easy. There's a lot we can't see yet. But this church has done hard things before. Can I get an amen? We know that Jesus asks us to do hard things, and though we may drag our feet at first, we are always, always grateful that he tests us, pushes us, because it lets us find out what we are really made of, especially when lives are on the line. Church, we started an Alzheimer's Day treatment center. For decades, we ran a thrift shop that earned $35,000 a year for those on the margins, a place that also gave those marginalized people a safe place to gather. And 35 years ago, we did build housing, Amistad House, which to this day still houses 70 low-income seniors in a lovely building off Shattuck. We have $3 million left over from the sale of that housing to do something noble with. We could do this again. You might say, how much could we build? It's a drop in the bucket against the enormous tide of need. But it's not a drop in the bucket for those children who would have a safe place to play and study and sleep, who would have a chance at a different kind of life because they have 4 strong walls and a roof that will never catch fire again. We cannot begin to measure the downstream effects of those hundreds of children who would have a stable place from which to launch a bigger life, which would benefit their children, which would benefit their children. And those children, as we teach our own church kids, are our children. to be called a repairer of broken walls and a restorer of ruined neighborhoods, as Isaiah put it, is to be dedicated to reclaiming a community's safety and dignity from those who would steal and destroy it. Sometimes I might prefer to have Robert Frost's sweet, simple, bucolic life, where the greatest worry is whether or not his apples will fall on his neighbor's side of the wall. But apparently I chose the city, this city. You chose this city. And God chose us to be repairers of the breach in whatever way we might have the courage for. If not us, who? If not now, when? On Wednesday, a bus full of Japanese Americans returned to Berkeley from a 75th anniversary alumni trip to Topaz, the concentration camp in Nevada, where they had been incarcerated with their families during World War II. 4 of them were processed through our church campus on that day, 75 years ago. We offered them shelter and food during a hellish time, day shelter. We took care of those particular children, all grown up, 82 years old, 89 years old. We watched them while their parents did paperwork and loaded the buses with belongings. We took their pets home. In some cases, took more responsibility as a wider community for their valuables and their homes. Due to the hard work of Milton Fuji, who made so much come together on Wednesday, he found out about the bus with returning pilgrims and asked if they would stop by the church, a return trip 75 years later. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday, we were waiting for them with tears in our eyes and full hearts. Louise, our church administrator, had made big paper signs at the last minute that we all held up as they got off the bus. Weary, happy, glad to see us. The signs said, "Welcome home."